the West constructed the East in order to be able to ideologically control it. In other words, it created categories that then justified colonial practice. And so if we think with Said here, we can understand the concepts that are produced by the war on terror, terrorism discourses such as radicalization, the extremist, the terrorist, the jihadi bride. All of those constructs then allow what? They allow Muslims to be, for example, detained without charge indefinitely. They allow Muslims to be extradited, tortured, droned, um, kept in solitary confinement, contained in refugee camps, which are seen as humanitarian responses to refugee movement, but in fact are nothing more than efforts to contain securitized populations and prevent them from moving towards borders where asylum-seeking claims can be made. I think it's really important to continue to see that relationship then between state violence, imperial projects, empire building, and how Muslims are constructed, how Muslims are managed, how Muslims are disciplined in the current world system. The academy is definitely implicated in the production of anti-Muslim racism, right? And the academy is definitely central for propagating that, because all of those journals and all of the conferences and all the papers that come out of that are recirculating this racialization of Muslim people as irrational, pre-modern, illiberal, and therefore a threat to the West. And therefore a threat not just to the West, but a threat that has to be contained and eliminated through death dealing practices. And this is where the death then enters into the picture again. And this is where universities and the academy are complicit. The liberalism that animates the world system today, animates national politics today, is a liberalism that is conditional, right? It's conditional on being a white property male still to this day, right? And if you're a woman and if you're racialized in any way, then you just don't count as being eligible for these kind of universal rights. That Muslim women are caught in this bind, where on one hand they're racialized and they want to distance themselves from the racialization because racialization means slow death, imminent death. And so what do? They die a spiritual death, right? They devitalize their Muslimness. They take off the hijab or they distance themselves from Islam itself. And so now you have spiritual death and physical death that kind of surrounds Muslim women, where to avoid spiritual death or to avoid physical death, they have to undergo spiritual death. But then if they want to not die spiritually, then they have to accept dying a slow death or this kind of imminent death.
Okay, great. We are here today with Dr. Amina Shareef. We saw you on very recently on the Thinking Muslim podcast, where you did a very, very interesting interview about Islamophobia. But before we get into that a bit deeper, maybe you can, for our audience, introduce yourself a bit. What do you do? What are your interests?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Kareem and Peter, for having me on your show. So I see myself as a researcher of anti-Muslim racism, and I'm really interested in the intersection of gender and race, especially as they articulate in hijab politics, right? And Muslim women's experiences and and how Muslim women's bodies are used to advance the agenda of the war on terror. And it was through my research of young Muslim women's experiences with Islamophobia that I began to develop an interest in Islamophobia as a form of, as a racial project that deals deaths in Muslim populations in various forms. So, that's a really brief history of who I am, what I do.
Great, great, fantastic. Yeah, I think what you're focused on is hyper timely, so to speak. I mean, I don't think there's any country, at least in the West, where Islamophobia is not a central problem that we currently see. My question first is, and you just said it already. You said that Islamophobia can be considered a kind of death dealing project. And can you maybe expand on this a little bit? What do you exactly mean by that? We are an anti, or you could say an anti-imperialist channel. We focus a lot on Western imperialism.
Mhm.
And so for me, it actually makes sense what you're saying. But I think a lot of people will think, well, hey, wait a minute, Islamophobia, isn't that just that you have a problem with Islam? But there's more to that. And maybe you can explain to us a bit what you mean by that.
Definitely. There's definitely more to Islamophobia than what is popularly conceded, right? So oftentimes people are confused with the term Islamophobia because it has the term phobia in it, and so they immediately sort of attach this idea that it's a kind of pathology, right? It's an individual pathology. It resides within individuals, and therefore it's not a systemic institutional sort of problem. And so that is what I would sort of call the prejudice slash bias camp of Islamophobia studies. It's an approach that sees Islamophobia as contained by bad apples in a society, and these bad apples are sort of in the margins. And Islamophobia is not something that polite classes and educated classes in society sort of adhere to, and it's certainly not an integral part of a institutional landscape, as you suggested earlier. So moving into then taking a different approach to Islamophobia means we would have to sort of understand one, that it's institutional, and it approximates other forms of racism like anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism as well. And this is where I sit. I sit in, literature that looks at Islamophobia as a form of racism. And and when I'm able to do that, and by taking this perspective, I'm able then to say that it has this kind of structural dimension. And the structural dimension does something, right? It doesn't simply exclude Muslims from accessing employment, education, housing, healthcare, and health itself. But all of those exclusions can be interpreted as devitalizing the Muslim population, right? It creates conditions where Muslim life cannot flourish and it's merely surviving. And this is where I began to think about Islamophobia as this kind of this social system that produces the slow death of Muslim populations. But when I take a transnational approach to anti-Muslim racism and I zoom out of the local context and I zoom out of Muslim experiences in Western states, and I start looking at state violence that is directed at Muslim populations in the form of targeted killing by drones, in the form of containment of refugees in refugee camps, in the form of abandonment of asylum seekers as they try to cross the Mediterranean Sea. Um, I am inclined to also see anti-Muslim racism as this system that produces imminent death to Muslim populations. And one of the key sort of assumptions that we make in race and racism studies about Islamophobia is that Islamophobia and racism is not incidental, right? It is willful and there is a political design to it all. And so when you see death as sort of this a significant effect of anti-Muslim racism, then you can begin to say that anti-Muslim racism deals death to Muslim populations, that it is a death dealing project itself. And that's what I mean when I say that.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know if this is a good time to jump in because I listened to your interview and I thought you made a very interesting like semantic point about
Mhm.
using anti-Islamic racism rather than Islamophobia or anti-Islamic prejudice or a similar term. And it's something that I think probably Kareem and I share this. Uh, I don't know if annoyance is the right word, but the
Mhm.
continued use of race as a category as if it's actually a scientific category,
Mhm.
when we now know that it's pure pseudoscience developed essentially to justify the slave trade. And today, with modern genetic science, we know that there's no real there. It's just an arbitrary separation of the human race into these pseudo races. But I was kind of convinced by your use of the term because sadly, the term racism is used in so many areas to denote basically just prejudice against groups of people, and people don't really take
Hmm.
the kind of etymology of race and its pseudoscientific background. So sadly enough, I think we kind of do have to meet people where they're at in terms of the concepts that they use. Could you just go over why you think it is that uh, it's a more useful, more better explanatory term rather than something like, if I had my way, it would be anti-Islamic outgroup antipathy. But,
Mhm.
what a horrible term. It's too many syllables, etc. Could you explain to the audience a bit of your thinking behind your use of that term?
Sure. And I agree with your analysis, Peter, about people not understanding that racism is not just this notion of races existing as it were without being socially constructed, but racism is a process, right, of producing those races in the first place. And so that's what I like about the notion of racism is that it recognizes that, as you said, races are socially constructed. And in the same way that you can construct blackness as a race and whiteness as a race, you can also construct Muslimness as a race. And Muslimness as a race is constructed through culture, right? So Muslim practices and certain narratives about Muslim practices, specifically Muslim, quote unquote, Muslim misogyny, for example, forced veiling, honor killings, female genital mutilation, terrorist marriages, all of these are taken as some kind of intrinsic, is some kind of sign of something essential and inherent to Muslim populations, as something that suggests their racial difference from other populations, white populations, and so on and so forth. And and I think that's where racism is useful, is that it tells us that when we hear these narratives in circulation that demonize and otherize and dehumanize Muslim people, it's these narratives are racializing Muslim populations. They are suggesting that there's something inherently, biologically, essentially different about Muslim people. And I think that is really important to foreground because when we do that, then we are saying that Muslim people are located on this racial hierarchy below whiteness, right? Or in relation to whiteness and in relation to blackness. And then because Muslims then are seen to be a form of life that's not really a life, right? Because whiteness and white life is considered to be life itself, and every other life after that is simply this kind of perhaps animal life. Then, once we start to understand that relationship, then we can see that violence becomes not just normal, but necessary in order for the flourishing of life that is considered life, or in other words, white populations. So that is what for me is the value that racism as a explanatory framework gives to the discussion of Islamophobia is that it recognizes that these cultural narratives say something about the racial character of Muslim populations, and then it justifies violence towards them. And that, for me, the violence towards them pushes us to start to think about what racism does beyond simply excluding Muslims from social goods and resources.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely, and very, very well put. And I also remember when you discussed racism on the Thinking Muslim podcast, you said that, and I so agree with that. You said that racism. So indeed, racism is just racism serves a function. Racism is there to oppress another group. Racism is a justification for the oppression by another group. And of course, you can say a lot of people would say, yeah, but Muslims are not a race. Islam is not a race. And the funny thing is then if you ask the question back, yeah, but is black or white a race?
Mhm.
nobody can actually say, "Oh, yeah, but these are real racists," because then you're actually a racist. And most people will admit, no, racism doesn't really exist, except when you're some kind of extreme right biological racist. So, in other words, if you focus on the function of racism, not if races are real or not, but purely on the function of racism, then you can see that Islamophobia does the exact same thing. And it's just such a good explanation because, yeah, it's on people. When people say that, they don't even realize they're engaging in racism themselves when they say, yeah, but Islam is not a race. But people never realize when they say that, yeah, wait a minute, but all the other so-called races, are these real races? No. So why are they called races? Aha, because of a certain function. And that
Mhm.
function, oppression, dominance, you can put that, you can tie that same function to Islamophobia, correct?
Absolutely. And I agree with you. I think you really explained that well, that if we just look at what Islamophobia does, then we can approximate it to anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism and other forms of racism directed toward indigenous people. And yeah, it's really important to focus on what these constructs do and then not get caught up in this discussion about whether they're real or not, because that doesn't really serve. That doesn't serve the political project, which is what we're a part of when we have these discussions on Islamophobia. We're not just having these discussions because we want to have a nice intellectual conversation, but we want to improve Muslim life chances and we want to make it possible for Muslim populations to flourish. And so having that focus on the effect of Islamophobia allows us to do that.
Mm.
Right.
And in a similar way to how like the construction of race as a category in the first instance was essentially to justify the enslavement of people for, you know, the plantation economies of the Americas. What would you say are the primary reasons for this kind of construction or this essentializing of Muslim people in a very similar way that is involved in race? What would you say the primary functions are? Like, where does it originate? What's the original kind of political aim of this kind of essentialization?
That's a fantastic question. It's a fantastic question, Peter, because it tries to ground this discussion in whose interests are served when Islamophobic when Islamophobia is installed and circulated. And so there have been different theories about that try to link Islamophobia to racial capitalism, linking it to the extraction of Muslim resources in the Middle East, linking it to the displacement of Muslim people from their land, such as the case of Palestine. And then, of course, electoral politics and creating national identity in relation to the other that doesn't belong. So there are a host of reasons, or there are a host of ways in which Islamophobia does work for various political projects. Islamophobia also allows for this civilizational line to be drawn across the globe, right? This line that divides the West from Islam, really. And the West here means those people and those nations that uphold whiteness and uphold liberal values and uphold um, a world system that is based on liberal values such as equality, democracy, sovereignty, and so on and so forth. So I'm not suggesting that Islam doesn't abide by these liberal notions or Muslims don't abide by these liberal notions, but Muslims, as a faith-based population, they come with a different way of knowing the world. And that way of knowing the world means that our practice of equality is going to look different, and our practice of democracy is going to look different. But in in the current liberal order, the expectation is that if you want to modernize, you need to look like the West. You have to imitate the West in its cultural, political, economic, social, um, gender forms. You can't look different from the West if you want to be part of this global community that belongs to whiteness. And so I think that's where Islam poses a challenge. And that's where Islam is sort of held outside of that civilizational line, is because we come to the world stage with a different way of knowing and being and living in this world.
Can I just ask a
Yeah.
quick follow-up? I'm wondering if you would kind of periodize different, like Islamophobia changing, or rather, anti-Islam racism changing over time, because you have the whole idea of Orientalism from Said, but that, from what I understand, is focused mostly on the kind of first European attempts to colonize and control West Asia, North Africa. And do you think that it has undergone any sort of mutation recently during the whole GWAT era, the global war on terror?
I'm glad you're connecting the global war on terror to historical antecedents because as as we know on this podcast, and a lot of people are not aware, Islamophobia has deeper roots than that go beyond 9/11 and go beyond the war on terror. And these deeper roots, we can track them back to Orientalism. And we see in the global war on terror discourses this revitalization of the the tropes and the images and the concepts that were produced by the colonial enterprise, right? This idea of the imperial Muslim woman has roots in colonial knowledge systems, and we see it again in the war on terror. So you see that continuity across those two historical moments. But we could actually even track Islamophobia even before, right? Even before Orientalism. We could track it back to um, the expulsion of Muslim people from Spain in 1492, roughly 1492. And we know that there are scholars of Islamophobia who are periodizing the beginning, quote unquote, of Islamophobia back to that moment and the creation of this world system with the colonization of the Americas. So we could actually even go further back before 1492 and say, there was this crusadorial kind of um, engagement with Islam. And you have this entire archive where Islam is being otherized and demonized and associated with evil and associated with demonic forces. And that exists too, right? And so I think we could continuously go back up to the time Islam sort of emerged, or, as from a Muslim perspective, the time that um, the Quran was revealed and Islam became a thing, right? I think we would go back to that very moment and sort of try to look for continuities across that large span of time and space. But of course, that's very difficult to do. And I'm not suggesting that that would even be valuable for a particular empirical study or inquiry, but I think keeping in mind that Islamophobia has really long roots is important for understanding the role then of Islamophobia in producing the modern world system, and also in producing the nation state, and in producing this idea of civilization, and producing the notion of the UK, producing the notion of France and the Netherlands, and um, different concepts that we don't think are made in relation to anti-Muslim racism, but in fact they are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And it also shows, of course, something, and it's very funny. You were explaining in the beginning about individual bias and that kind of stuff, and I saw Peter immediately sending me a message. Sounds like your research. And the
Oh
funny thing is,
no.
I've been writing in social psychology already, paper after paper, saying that racism is cultural and not individual bias. Or you could even say those individual bias are a product of cultural conditioning. So, in other words, I often say these are not biases; these are natural adaptations to a racist environment. That's what I often write about in psychology. So, I was very happy when you said that, and I think Islamophobia is a deeply entrenched cultural phenomenon in the West. I would say that Islamophobia is really part of Western culture, just as white supremacy, anti-black, brown racism is. And Islamophobia functions on so many levels. You could say so many cultural levels, macro levels, from imperialism to media systems to micro levels such as individual bias and all that kind of stuff. But also, of course, the academic level. I remember actually talking to Peter maybe approximately a year ago. You remember, Peter, when I said we need to write a critical paper about the extremist mind studies. Remember terrorism studies? We had in
Mm.
psychology, we had these. Oh my God, so angering and frustrating. You had these paper after paper about what makes somebody an extremist or what makes somebody a so-called Islamic terrorist. And it was all about the personality characteristics and the kinds of authoritarian personality, social dominance, orientation, all that kind of stuff. And in a way, that kind of individualization, but also essentializing of the extremist mind puts the onus on the so-called Muslims, okay? Because that is what people try to say. So academia is another layer of that kind of Islamophobic propaganda, cultural, you can almost say, propaganda system. And how do you see that? Maybe you can explain that better than me. I've heard you also talk about the essentializing of the Muslim mind and Muslim behavior in and also in academia. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit? How that also how these layers, such as academia, contribute to Islamophobia in Western culture?
Sure. And I can pick up where you left off on extremism being associated with Muslim mentalities and mindsets. So in the academia, in academic spaces, you have terrorism discourses that are produced, right? You have terrorism studies and you have terrorism degrees that are offered and terrorism courses that are offered, and you have terrorism conferences and terrorism journals. And so you have basically a home within academia for essentially what is a pseudoscience, right? Terrorism studies has been dismissed as this kind of pseudoscience because it doesn't it tries to create these pathology or typologies of what an extremist looks like and where an extremist or a terrorist comes from. What is their trajectory before they commit political violence? And oftentimes these studies are not rooted in empirical work, right? They're rooted in very small sample sets, or they just don't have any kind of empirical basis. And so Islamophobia or terrorism studies has been sort of seen is being seen as this kind of race science that is particular about Muslim people today. Now, terrorism studies, it creates this demarcation, right, between legitimate violence and illegitimate violence. It's very clear that illegitimate violence is violence that is enacted by non-state actors, and legitimate violence is the violence of militaries and personal intelligence agencies and security forces that are acting on behest of these states. And so by creating this notion of the of illegitimate violence, terrorism studies suggest that the terrorist, therefore, is doing so out of irrational reasons, reasons that emerge out of culture, as opposed to state violence, military occupation, war, extraction, displacement of people, and so on and so forth. These are the reasons why people resist, right? And resistance is called terrorism, and resistance is a product of imperial violence. And so terrorism sort of brushes all of that complexity under the rug and sort of dismisses terrorism as the fanaticism of these religious fundamentalists. And so it's going back to the mind here, right? There's this notion that the Muslim mind is not capable of reasoning, right? As a way of setting the Muslim in opposition to the liberal subject. The Muslim is not capable of reason and therefore is inclined to superstition, irrational ways of knowing, such as belief in an unseen. And terrorism is just a product of that, right? And this is a discourse that is produced by the academy. And so the academy is definitely implicated in the production of anti-Muslim racism, right? And the academy is definitely central for propagating that, because all of those journals and all of the conferences and all the papers that come out of that are recirculating this racialization of Muslim people as irrational, pre-modern, illiberal, and therefore a threat to the West. And therefore a threat, not just to the West, but a threat that has to be contained and eliminated through death dealing practices. And this is where the death then enters into the picture again. And this is where universities and the academy are complicit in these regimes of death across the world that target Muslim people with all sorts of injury and violence, including street violence, anti-Muslim street violence in Western states.
Mm. I wonder, this thought just came to me, so it might still be half baked, but I wonder if there's another irony here in that is the way that you think Islam is essentialized in anti-Islamic racism very similar to the what's called Islamic fundamentalism that was promoted by the US government, with the British government, the Saudi government, probably other allied governments, as a kind of tool against communism during the Cold War. And so is that an additional irony in that now the supposed essence of all Muslim people is conflated or collapsed on this one version, or some might say perversion of Islam that was able to widely very governments that today promote Islamophobia or anti-Islamic racism on the basis of this essentialization? Or is that, would you
No, I would agree with you, Peter. And I think the West, it it is responsible for a lot of boomerangs, right? That come back and bite it in its heels. Um, Homegrown terrorism, what is called homegrown terrorism, right, is nothing more than that colonial boomerang coming back to the colonial metropole. When Western military interventions in Muslim lands um, make people take up arms and resist, and that resistance takes the form of quote unquote political violence when you have such asymmetries in the kind of technical advantages that we see between Western militaries and Muslim militaries, right? Or militaries of Muslim majority states. There's a huge difference in the capacity to resist. And so resistance takes the form of political violence. And so that boomerang, that coming back is essentially a product of the West as well. And and I think, yeah, we have to acknowledge that the West has created a lot of the problems that we see today. It has produced these categories that once served it and now reproduce violence against Muslim people. And I think it's really important to continue to see that relationship then between state violence, imperial projects, empire building, and how Muslims are constructed, how Muslims are managed, how Muslims are disciplined in the current world system.
Yeah,
but just to
I think you
clarify,
said.
really quickly, in your conception of anti-Islamic racism, the essentialization that's done, the supposed essence of Muslims that this view propagates, is it basically saying that all Muslims are like the kind of fundamentalist, or maybe I shouldn't do quotes on fundamentalist, but rather put quotes on Islam. um, is that kind of the core of it? The idea that these people are just like a lot of the extremists that were funded and supported by the U.S. and UK, Saudi, Pakistan, etc. You know, the great freedom fighters. You know, is that the content, or would you say it's different? It's more than that or less than that?
I think I would agree with what you're saying, Peter, that that is the content of the Muslim as he or she is being racialized today. Um, there's this, because there's not a problem with liberal Muslims, right? Muslims who adopt a liberal worldview and who advocate for liberal values in a way that mirrors the way the West is enacting them, right? Um, but as soon as you exist in the Muslim as a Muslim person, right? And you're drawing on Islam, then you become this extremist, you become this fundamentalist. You're too tightly rooted to scripture, whether it's Quranic scripture or Sunnah-based tradition. You're too rooted to that. You're a fundamentalist now. You should understand, as Sabah Mahmood says, that these sacred scriptures are just there for your spiritual and aesthetic enjoyment, but they don't have any kind of epistemological force in the world. In other words, don't at all costs think with them when you try to live in this world and try to establish societies and you try to think about what counts as flourishing, human flourishing, or what counts as a good economic system, or what counts as a good social system, or what counts as a racial system. Don't think with these religious traditions. And the moment you do, you're the Muslim Brotherhood, right? You're an Islamist party. You are, and therefore your political ideology, and you're a threat to this kind of liberal-based order that the West has tried militarily through hard power and soft power strategies to install. So yes, that's a long answer for saying yes, Peter. I think there's a notion of the fundamentalist and contemporary racializations of the Muslim.
Mm, thanks.
Yeah, I've in one of my articles, I've actually called Islamophobia the holy grail of imperial ideologies, and because I think there is a kind of you can almost say nefarious intention about the things that are happening. So often people talk about blowback, for example, funding extremism in Afghanistan or Syria. And I wonder if that is really what you can call blowback, at least for those in the ruling class, so to speak. Because I would say that the funding of extremism in West Asia and other parts of the Muslim world, so to speak, actually serves imperialism. I mean, these are the favorite Hollywood stereotypes that are being funded. I always call them Hollywood stereotypes, these extremists. And one of our guests once said, I really like that, late Maruf, who said that these extremists that you now see, for example, in Syria, he said that these are the most westernized Muslims you can imagine. And what he meant was like they're sectarian, they're supremacist. And he said that these are a result of the funding by imperial powers such as Saudi Arabia, United States, Israel. So my question is, when we talk about the death dealing project that you just spoke about, I want to go a little bit deeper into that. Would you say that Islamophobia, therefore, is a kind of intentional ideology to be able for example, imperial powers, let's say the United States, to be able to engage in certain forms of death dealing? So, in other words, it's an intentional project, an intentional ideology.
I do, Kareem. I do say that it's an intentional political project. Now, I'm reminded here of Edward Said's work in Orientalism. Peter, you mentioned Orientalism. And in this book, Said, he tells us that the West constructed the East in order to be able to ideologically control it. In other words, it created categories that then justified colonial practice. And so if we think with Said here, we can understand the concepts that are produced by the war on terror, terrorism discourses such as radicalization, the extremist, the terrorist, the jihadi bride. All of those constructs then allow what? They allow Muslims to be, for example, detained without charge indefinitely. The Hollywood stereotypes, you're right. They allow Muslims to be extradited, tortured, droned, um, kept in solitary confinement, contained in refugee camps, which are seen as humanitarian responses to refugee movement, but in fact are nothing more than efforts to contain securitized populations and prevent them from moving towards borders where asylum-seeking claims can be made, right? So there is definitely this worlding process that Said talks about in Orientalism here in the contemporary moment, where a particular world is being created in order to ideologically manage it. But if we examine the or sorry, not ideologically manage it, to manage it, to discipline it, right? And to contain its threat. And if we look at the precise techniques that are used to manage Muslim populations, these are techniques of death dealing, torture, targeted killing by drones, solitary confinement. So it's a form of slow death, but it's still death itself. Abandonment in the sea, for asylum seekers who are trying to cross it in unseaworthy vessels. This is a kind of abandonment to death. And so these disciplinary techniques do deliver death, and they are authorized through Islamophobia. And so going back to what you said earlier, Kareem, that Islamophobia is part of the Holy Grail, is, part of the Holy Grail, if I'm saying this right, of empire. And I agree with this frame of analysis because, um, concepts of equality and sovereignty and religious freedom and all of these liberal concepts that were produced in the Enlightenment and then went on to define a world system that went on to define the superiority of these uh, colonizing forces, of these empires that were going around the world and setting up colonies, that these concepts and liberalism itself d required that Muslim people, indigenous people, Black people be scripted outside of the universal category of the human in order to produce those concepts in the first place, the concepts that went on to create the world system that we live in today. And so, definitely, anti-Muslim racism is fundamental to empire. It's fundamental to the ongoing imperial projects today led by the West and its ally, or led by the US and its allies. Yeah,
That's
It's
also
it's kind
why
of
it doesn't apply to the Muslims, I would say. So these you're talking about those liberal values and all these kind of things, and the Enlightenment, and you have to place the Muslim outside of that framework because you don't apply those liberal values to the Muslims. They don't have that
absolutely.
freedom of religion. They don't have the same freedoms as human beings.
That's
So
right.
yeah, I just want to jump in. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I was actually going to make basically the same point. Like there's this book, what is it, the racial contract that looks
Hmm.
at early liberal thinkers and how they're able to construct a supposedly universalist ideology, but then at the same time, a lot of these people like John Stuart Mill were eager supporters of British colonization in India. So, how do you square those?
Hmm.
Well, you carve out exceptions and say, well, yes, our universalist principles apply to everyone, asterisk, who
Hmm.
adheres to these, like, or has achieved this level of rationality and
Hmm.
civilization, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, it's very easy to see how you can just make exceptions for everyone that you want to steal from or
That's
everyone you
right.
want to enslave.
Hmm. That's a perfect explanation. I don't have to say anything more. Yeah, and I think that book is Charles Mills, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it.
And it's his concept of racial liberalism.
That's it. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, such a useful concept. Such a useful concept to understand that the liberalism that animates the world system today, animates national politics today, is a liberalism that is conditional, right? It's conditional on being a white property male still to this day, right? And if you're a woman and if you're racialized in any way, then you just don't count as being eligible for these kind of universal rights.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you highlighted the fact that there's an extra layer here when it comes to Islamophobia and being a Muslim woman. I've seen
Mhm.
that in the Netherlands too. The Muslim woman is somehow targeted on so many levels. Can you maybe go a bit deeper into that? What do you mean that it's especially harrowing being a Muslim woman in the West?
Right. I don't think people, thank you for that question, Kareem, because I don't think people really understand to what extent gender is so fundamental in propping up anti-Muslim racism. If anti-Muslim racism depends on creating the civilizational line between Islam and the West, right? Then it's done through the bodies of Muslim women, right? Muslim women's bodies are pointed at as being, mutilated, forced into arranged marriages, child marriages, cousin marriages. They are seen as beaten up and so on and so forth, and not given rights to sexual rights, not given work rights to work rights to go out of the house, so on and so forth. So the Muslim woman therefore becomes this embodied image of how Islam is so anti-feminist, how Islam is so anti-civilizational, right? And that is the very substance on which Islam then is positioned in opposition to the West. So that couldn't happen unless you had this mutilated Muslim woman, right? This is what Shireen Raza calls the Imperial Muslim woman. And And then the hijab then, because it's placed in the same grid of social, it's placed on the same grid of gender relations as honor killings, forced veilings, polygamous marriages, so on and so forth. It's taken to symbolize then all that is anti-feminist about Islam and all that is hostile about Islam to the West. And so whenever the hijab then is seen in the West itself, it's seen as a political kind of confrontation, right? It's seen as an ideological uh, an ideological challenge to liberalism. And for those who, absorb this Islamophobic rhetoric that defines nationhood through through Muslims not belonging, then we're seen as not belonging. We're seen as not having the right to be here. We're seen as not having the right to have access to everything else that everyone else has access to, like employment, education, housing, health, and healthcare, right? So the hijab, very important to excluding Muslims from life chances and therefore um, creating the conditions of the slow death of Muslim populations.
Yeah,
Mm.
and it brings us again to the Hollywood stereotype, yeah, that what I was just talking about, of the Muslim woman that needs to be saved by the white man. And that is something that we saw in my country too, these discussions all the time about how they need to be emancipated. And then so yeah, it brings me back to those days, terrible days. I'm happy I'm not living in that environment anymore. But it also reminds me of a tweet I read on your on your website, which reads, if I may.
You
Um,
may.
as a Muslim woman, I have a foolproof career plan B. Ditch the scarf, post some before, burkini, and after, bikini photos, and invent a forced marriage story featuring a goat and cooking oil as dowry. Instant book contract, news and radio airtype, honorary degrees. Well, I really like that sarcasm in behind that tweet, because I think this tweet fits in every European country.
That's
Every
right. Yeah.
European country.
And it
Yeah.
really captures how, Muslim women are seen as nothing more than sexual objects that are hidden away behind hijabs and scarves and abayas and dresses and long skirts if you're in France. And their sexuality is controlled through marriage and cousin marriage and polygamous marriage and FGM. So they're nothing more than sexual objects. And therefore, they need to be liberated. They need to become women with a capital W. And to do so, you have to look like women. And if you can't, because we have brown skin and black skin, then you need to look like women in the way you express your sexuality, in the way you express your femininity. And that means undressing in some ways, right? If I'm going to be blunt, in the West, there's a particular feminine norm that allows women to express themselves through clothing and removing clothing. And if that is equated then with women's liberation, if that particular form of being a woman is equated with female liberation, then that's what Muslim women have to become in order to be liberated. And I push back against that because you know, for me, the hijab is none of those things. It's not a tool of managing my femininity or sexuality. It's something that I chose to do. And, I'm married to um, a convert Muslim, incidentally. And incidentally, he's also, a Frenchman. And so, if anything, I should be, the target of some forced unveiling by my husband. But I choose to wear it. I still wear it, and I feel a lot of strength in wearing it. I see value in wearing it, and I don't. And I'm an educated person, and or I've been educated in the West in these ideas of liberalism, and I still don't subscribe to them. So I think there's a lot to be said then about how Muslim women understand the hijab and contrast that with how the hijab is being constructed by, liberal feminists, and therefore, um, and therefore pointing to how the hijab then is central in producing Islamophobic narratives about Islam and Muslims.
Mm. I see. I've been thinking about your idea of like the racialization of Islam, and it strikes me that there was this one of my favorite writers is Gore Vidal, and in like 1990 or so he spoke at the press club in D.C. And some journalist asked him, what is the U.S. going to do without its big the enemy, the USSR? And he said something like, first of all, it's kind of a ballsy question coming from people whose job it is to construct, the enemy for the U.S. But it seems like there's a sector of like neoconservatives and the Israel lobby that's pushing for Arabs to become the enemy. But that won't do because they're too numerous and have too much oil. Some parts of the corporate sector are pushing for the Japanese to be the enemy. But that won't do because they have too much money and they'll buy the TV networks and show us many soothing hours of the tea ceremony, which would have been great. I think if US TV just only had the tea ceremony, that would be an improvement. But you know what? I bring that up in classes sometime to make the point that, well, it turns out he was wrong. The U.S. ended up turning Arabs into the enemy, but if from your perspective, it seems like the trick really was not so much about Arabs as an ethnic group, but rather taking Islam as a religious group or Muslims as a religious group and racializing them. But how would you then say, because it seemed to me like there was a kind of a division imposed. You know, obviously the US's client regimes all throughout West Asia, North Africa, you can't demonize them because they're important in maintaining the empire, but they're also Muslim. So you have to kind of create this separate category that you can really demonize and turn into the enemy that everyone needs to be afraid of, and which justifies, spending on killing machines and using those killing machines to kill people. Is that how do you see that? Do you think that there is this kind of division introduced between like the good Muslims and the bad essentialized Muslim to be afraid of?
I do. I do think that there is still that good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy at play here. And I know that it was, this construction that was really important in the early days of the War on Terror, when, it was actually coined by George Bush himself, and he sort of identified the good Muslims as those who would participate in helping the West root out terrorism. And then the bad Muslim was doctrinal and, it was anti-West and very virulent. So that construct continues today. And we see that with the way counter-extremism policies rolled out in the UK, for example. The czars of counter-extremism are Asian Muslims, right? Who sort of say we're on the side of the security state and we're going to help you sort of rein in and manage and control these bad Muslims. And so then there's this constitution of the good Muslim here, right? The good Muslim is the one who, continues to help the state in rooting out the bad Muslims, helps the state, right, in this liberal project of assisting Muslim people into true personhood, right? Because counter-extremism is about um, asking Muslim people to shed particular political alliances, to become liberal subjects, to see their identity in relation to the nation state instead of this larger global community of believers, the Ummah, the Muslim Ummah. So it's trying to remake Muslimness in some ways. And that remaking of Muslimness can be seen as bringing Muslim people into this liberal subjectivity. And so here you have this case where brown people are helping the West, or, these counter-extremism institutions uh, remake Muslimness, right? These bad Muslims. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because then we begin to see that what's at problem is not the body of the Muslim, right? But it's the content of the Muslim belief, right? It's the kind of political affiliations the Muslim has. It's the kind of alliances that we'll make, like pro-Palestine solidarities, right? Those are the problems that that's what's problematic about the Muslim. But if we go even further, what's really problematic is that there's Islam in us, right? Because what is Islam? it is also a way of knowing that's different from liberalism. And I come back to this, right? In this global moment where the West and its allies has brought it upon itself to install liberalism as the political order by which the world is to be organized, right? Its concepts are going to be the organizing concepts for the world, then Islam poses a challenge to that. And the Muslim who contains that Islam becomes the vessel, therefore, for that challenge to be expressed. And so it's in stamping out that Islam that liberalism, therefore, can continue its project of installing itself. And so that's where I think we need to focus. We need to pay attention to that dynamic. Because in doing so, then we see that the bad Muslim is redeemable, right? As once they become liberal, they're redeemable. But then we really get a sense of what anti-Muslim racism also is trying to do. What is its objective, right?
Mm.
I don't know
Yeah,
if I
Yeah.
made sense there.
yeah,
No, absolutely.
it did, and it then made me think. Like, I tried to apply your concept of like racializing a group that isn't even a pseudo race.
Hmm.
So, but it made me think like maybe that I think is probably an accurate way of describing kind of anti-communism in the West as well. Like, it wasn't just an ideological opposition; it also essentialized these people as brainwashed. They
Hmm.
want to control the world. They'll trick your children into their project of totalitarianism, and they just want unfreedom. They hate freedom so much.
Hmm.
But it I think you could apply that same way of using the concept of racialism, like
Hmm.
thinking that there are these races and they have essences, and I think it probably also applies to anti-communism in a way. And then the other commonality is that serves a very clear political, economic uh, agenda of
Hmm.
dominance.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry, it's just something that clicked in my mind as I was
No,
as you.
no. I'm glad you raised that connection because it makes me think of the indigenous person in what is now the United States, right? There was a policy to that, I mean, killing indigenous people was at one point the policy, the colonial settler logic in what is now the US. But at one point there was a change in that policy, and it became about saving the man but killing the Indian. I don't know if you've heard already. You've heard that, right? Save the man but kill the Indian. And so then there were these schools that were set up, and it was this logic of educating for extinction, extincting, right? What was considered to be Indian and therefore non-European, non-Enlightenment based, but re-educating therefore and redeeming the body and the subjectivity within it um, by making it liberal, right? By making it a European subject or a subject that is rooted in Eurocentrism. And I think that there is a lot of similarities in how Muslims are approached through counter-extremism practice and how these logics of elimination in settler colonial contexts drove policy to remake Indian people.
Mm, right, to make the good Indian, to make the good leftist would be someone who might, like Marx and whatnot, but they at least oppose the USSR or China, and
Well,
then
Right.
the good Muslim is one that
that
is assimilable. Yeah.
that brings me to something I actually wanted to say already a while back. That's very much related to the research that I'm currently also doing. And that is something called colonial mentality. And in
Hmm.
psychology, it's a very new construct, but it's a kind of internalized colonialism that you see among many of the, yeah, you could say people, oppressed groups under colonialism or neo colonialism. And when you talk about the good Muslim, that is after of course these are these prime examples of peak colonial mentality is what I
Hmm.
always say. And you
Absolutely.
see we see the same, we saw the same 20 years ago in my country, the Netherlands. We had this lady called Ayaan Hirsi Ali,
Mhm.
and she came from Somalia, right? Yeah, Somalia.
I think so.
And and she was the favorite immigrant in the Netherlands because she was, and here we go, ex-Muslim. Those are the
Mhm.
favorite ones because especially if it's an ex-Muslim, of course, who really trashes her original culture. And you were talking about that, the usage of the female body often as a kind of a stick to hit Muslims with. And indeed, she made a movie with our current one of our biggest leaders in the Netherlands called Geert Wilders, who is hyper Islamophobic. Uh, this all stuff already happened like 20 years ago. I always say when it comes to Islamophobia and racism, the Netherlands is always the trendsetter, but just doesn't get the attention because it's a small country. Now you see the same happening in Germany. This stuff is old news for us. And what they did is actually when they made that movie, it's called Fitna, and
Mhm.
they and the movie, all you all you saw most scenes you actually saw naked female bodies with Quran verses.
Mhm.
So to really use that female body, like you
Mhm.
just said, as a
Mhm.
kind of like as an abused body in Islam.
Mhm.
I have never seen it myself, but I've seen the pictures. People can just Google it, and that is so powerful what you said also about if you want to belong to the Western way of seeing the woman, seeing the female, you have to express yourself. The woman has to express herself and her body in a very different way. And it reminds me of something, a discussion I had with an Iranian friend of mine about Iranian liberals. And uh, and
Mhm.
and uh, and she or we discussed about how Iranian liberals who want to be liberal, who often also have a very strong feeling against Islam,
Mhm.
often post on social media videos like, oh, this is also Iran. And often it is women in very tight pants and very tight leggings. And look, this is also Iran. And I'm
Mhm.
always, all the time I'm thinking, like you want to say something with this. Like, look, we are worthy. We also show our body. Now, don't get me
Mhm.
wrong. Everybody is free to wear what they want. I really don't care. But it's
Mhm.
really, really striking that
Mhm.
often you have then these videos, for example, this is also Iran. And then you have these push-up bras, and then
Mhm.
like almost like you're trying to say, look, we are also sexualizing ourselves. We are also free people. And I always say
Mhm.
it's a kind of peak colonial mentality,
Mhm.
what you're seeing. It's deeply internalized inferiority, and they think they can like get rid of that or be part of the
Mhm.
so-called superior group by expressing themselves that way. You know what I mean? I hope
Yeah.
I'm making myself clear here.
No, no, that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And they're trying to prove that they're human, right? That look, we exist in this way, and therefore, because we exist like you, we've approximated ourselves to whiteness, and therefore we can hope that you might consider us as human, fully human, right? So there's an attempt there to sort of enter that universal category of what counts as human. And it's funny because in my own research, young Muslim girls in the UK, they were doing the same thing, right? They were trying to distance themselves from the visible signs of Muslimness, in order to say, I'm a human. I'm not racialized as the Imperial Muslim woman. I'm not a perilous Muslim woman. I am a liberal subject. And this is my attempt to um, be seen as a human. But the way I understood it is very um, it was very eye-opening for myself because I didn't see it as, okay, Muslim women are negotiating their identities in this particular moment, right? Because in a lot of the literature on Muslim women's experiences with Islamophobia, there's this tendency to interpret what you've just described as Muslim women negotiating Islamophobia. And I didn't take that perspective. I said, actually, this is Muslim women's attempts, specifically the UK, um, Muslim women and girls' attempts to avoid being racialized and therefore avoid being exposed to slow death or imminent death, right? And because of this, there's an interesting relation that then reveals itself, which is that Muslim women are caught in this bind, where on one hand they have they're racialized, and they want to distance themselves from the racialization because racialization means slow death, imminent death. And so what do? They die a spiritual death, right? They devalorize their Muslimness. They take off the hijab or they distance themselves from Islam itself. And so now you have spiritual death and physical death that kind of surrounds Muslim women, where to avoid spiritual death or to avoid physical death, they have to undergo spiritual death. But then if they want to not die spiritually, then they have to accept dying a slow death or this kind of imminent death. And so I'm calling this bind here, besieged life. Besieged life is this life that faces death on two fronts, physical and spiritual, and it escapes death through another form of death. But in other words, it's death bound. It cannot escape death. There's only two options for it, death and death. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that I wrote in one of my papers on internalized racism in Asia, and it's actually very similar to what I say. You make a very powerful point that they want to be human and seen as human.
Mm,
I remember also writing about a phenomenon over here that you see a lot about people who bleach their skin, and especially in formerly colonized countries, you see very strong skin bleaching.
mhm,
And I wrote about that this is often not even triggered by the idea that you think you will become more beautiful by bleaching your skin, but you just want to be treated as a normal human being.
mhm,
And
mm,
it's just that's
yeah,
so powerful what you just
mm,
said. Like
yeah,
you cannot even blame people for that
mm,
so-called colonial mentality or wearing
sure,
these kind of clothes or
sure,
because people just want to be seen as a human being, whether they do that by bleaching their skin or their hair or
mm,
to, like you said, just that
mm,
proximity to whiteness, not because
mm,
you really want to be white or that you think white people are more beautiful, but just because you want to be treated like a normal human being.
yeah,
It's so
yeah,
such a good and powerful point.
yeah.
Okay, Peter, you
And
maybe have
yeah,
one final thing to say or
sure.
before we
Well, I
wrap
mean,
it up?
just building
Yeah,
on
go ahead.
that.
Oh,
Oh, no,
please,
no,
please
sorry.
go
Did you
ahead.
say
No, no,
Peter or
no, go
Amina? I
ahead.
heard Amina.
Go
Yeah,
for it.
I'll make it quick then. But just building on that, Kareem, if you're not seen as human, then you are vulnerable to death, right? And so you're absolutely right. Can't blame them because they're just trying to survive and flourish, right? And so ultimately, what we need to do as, anti-racists or anti-imperialists, is to create conditions for people to flourish as they want to be, right? And not have to think about the possibility of death as they go about living in their own ways.
Yeah, and
Mm.
one final thing, Peter, before it also reminds me of an interview I just very recently saw with Ali Abu Nima, of the electronic intifada, and he said something, and that's also so related. He was put in jail in Switzerland because he is a journalist, the free liberal West. He's a journalist, but he said something really stood out to me, and he said when he entered the prison in Switzerland, he said every single inmate was Arab. He said every single one of them. So
Mm-hmm.
if you think about that and imagine being a Muslim or an Arab in Europe, I mean, are you surprised that you try to escape that kind
Mm-mm.
of fate
Mm-mm.
by being proximal to whiteness, whether it's taking off your hijab if you're a young teenager, you don't know how to deal with it, or you're somebody who's hiding their background. I
Mm-mm.
mean, yeah, all comes down to just that intrinsic need of human beings to just
Mm-mm.
be seen as an equal, like a like
Mm-mm.
a like a normal human being.
Yeah.
Yeah, Peter?
Yeah. No, on that same topic, I would recommend a classic paper in psychology from the 1930s, Kurt Lewin's on Jewish self-hatred. And I read
Okay.
that as he's actually talking about something that's universal, not particularistic at all. It's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what you guys have just been discussing, the felt need to distance oneself from their ethnic group or religious group because the majority in the country you're in views you with hate And so,
Mhm.
or original Jewishness, like Zionists are doing now, who see themselves more as white Europeans. It looks like.
right, he's describing like all these different ways to kind of like separate, deracinate yourself, basically, to kind of separate yourself from that group. Also, the group stereotypes that are imposed on you. But at any rate, I just threw that out there because it might be interesting for if you're
Yeah.
working on a paper or book on this, it might be something interesting to look at. The psychologist's view from the 1930s in the U.S. But we've kept you quite a while. You've been very generous with your time. Thank you for that. Do you have any like last thoughts you'd want to share with the audience? Maybe even recommending them check out, your writing or a website where your writings are available. Anything of that sort?
Um, well, I would be shamelessly plugging,
Yes, please.
my work, but I think I'm going to do that because at the end of the day, this work moves beyond us and our personal careers and our own self-enrichment. We're here because we want to, dismantle systems that expose populations to violence and, death. So, yeah, have a look at my website, have a look at some of the podcasts that I've done, some news articles that I've written. Have some papers coming out as well. So maybe have a look at those. What we're trying to do, myself and some colleagues, is really try to, make clear what that framework is of Islamophobia as this death dealing project. So if you're interested in Islamophobia from a perspective of death, then yeah, do look out for our writings on that.
Such shameless self-promotion from an oppressed
Oh
Muslim
goodness.
woman with the hijab. I'm shocked.
I know, I know. It's the one time we can do this, right? Otherwise, we have to take it off and be someone else. Yeah. But thanks for having me. I think, yeah, it was a great conversation. And,
Our
I
pleasure.
told my little boy this morning, I have a podcast to do with some colleagues in China. And he was like, "Oh, are you going to China today?" So he thought I was going to go to China and come back. So I should like tell him, "Yeah, I went to China, came back, and here I am."
Tell him how nice the people in China are.
Oh, I will. I will do that. But let's be in touch and maybe there's room
Yeah,
for collaboration. Maybe there's room for writing papers together, doing other podcasts, or writing some news articles
definitely.
together, maybe making links between China, right? Islamophobia in China and Islamophobia here, because we need that transnational perspective, right?
Hmm.
Otherwise it becomes, a case of French Islamophobia and UK, British Islamophobia and German Islamophobia. But in fact, there are like transnational connections between all of that.
And the new the enemy for the West is now going to be China, and they're
Mhm.
doubtlessly going to do the same sort of like quasi-racialization, like, oh, the essence of Chinese people is this and that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
of course,
Definitely.
funding extremism in China, like they did in
Mhm.
Afghanistan and Syria. They see the same happening in China by the U.S. Anyway, yeah, we should
Okay.
definitely stay in contact.
We'll be
We
in
definitely
touch.
would like to discuss with you more. There's so much more we'd like to ask. Amina, can we also add you to our Substack, by the way? We
Yes, you
also
can.
we write a lot about these things, so maybe you will find it very, or hopefully you will find it very interesting. And
Yes, definitely.
we keep you to it. We will definitely contact you again in the future to talk a bit more. You have done fantastic work. You opened the eyes probably of a lot of viewers. So thank you for that, and talk to you again.
Yes. Thank you for having me and see you again.
All
And
right.
next time we'll try to not keep you over an hour. I hope we didn't mess
Oh,
up
it's all
the
right.
schedule.
It was really a pleasure. Okay.
Likewise,
And say
likewise.
hi to your boy.
Okay.
Bye.
You take care then. Bye-bye.